Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Intellectual Conversations. I am your host, Jason Sylvester. Joining me today is John Warrington, who is a former Benedictine monk and is now working as a clinical psychologist. And he's here today to talk to me about homosexuality within the Catholic Church. So, John, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to come on. So,
Thank you. It's
welcome.
good to be with you.
So, just a bit of brief background. So, John and I did a podcast for Atheist Alliance International probably about a year ago now. John was came on as a member of the Clergy Project, which is for former members of the clergy, as the name implies. It was started by the Freedom from Religion Foundation to help clergy to transition, clergy who have lost their faith, to transition and to provide counseling and services like that to help them move into the secular world. So John came to me through that, and I've bounced a couple of ideas off him as I've been writing, and it occurred to me that I was finishing up a section on how the Catholic Church defines homosexuality currently in canon law, and I thought, well, why not have John come on and actually talk to us about what the culture is really like in the Catholic Church. So just briefly, so John was a Benedictine monk. He studied at a Jesuit school, and then ultimately lost his faith. So John, welcome. So maybe you can just briefly tell us a little bit about what led you to lose your faith.
What led me to lose my faith? Well, I think I said in the previous podcast that when I went to study at a Jesuit school in London, part of the University of London, when the freshman class came in, the president of the Jesuit got up and welcomed us all, and he said, one of the things he said, which has stuck with me till today, is when you came here, you thought it was all your questions answered. Instead, it will be all your answers questioned.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what it was. I came from I was a convert to Catholicism, and like a lot of converts, I came from the High Church of England, and I was rather, what you might call high church, spiky, very conservative background theologically when I entered the monastery. And so the study of theology really did open my mind to other ways of seeing things and other ways of questioning, because that's the way it teaches. When you study academic theology, if it's worth its weight in gold, then it's going to be questioning orthodoxies and truths. There's nothing worse than a type of theology that just teaches you the catechism. In other words, that would just teach you what is the party line. And so I was lucky to be in an environment where the orthodoxies and the truths that I held to be sacred were challenged. So that was the beginning, I guess, for me.
So you had an open mind, that you were receptive to these questions and not shut down as some do and just ignore it. So, okay.
Right.
All right. So back in April, I was writing the section of my book on the history of the Catholic Church on the section around Pope John the 23rd and the Second Vatican Council. And I'd come across a few references that tweaked for me. And so I reached out to John. So not to let the cat out of the bag, but John is a homosexual. So he's here to talk to us about the homosexuality in the church. So when I saw some of these clues about Pope John, so I reached out to John to ask him about this topic. And John had a very interesting reply. He described the culture of the church, and this is to quote you, John. So please, I'm not trying to take you out of context in case you forgot, but you said it was a subculture of screaming queens, is how you described it, and I found that description rather not troubling, but it was intriguing. So I thought, why not? Let's talk about that. So we have, we obviously people know the sex scandal that's been going on in the church that broke something like 24 years ago now, and it's been going. We've been seeing it all over the world, and obviously we're not conflating pedophilia with homosexuality, as some of the more evil-minded people try to do, to try to paint everybody in the same brush. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what your experiences are with one is being a homosexual in the church, and the homosexual culture that you saw around you in the church.
Well, two things I would say is that firstly is that it's been a long time since I was an active priest within the church. I'm out almost 30 years, so I can only speak to what was my experience back then. I think there was a subculture within the church, especially my experience in the seminaries, or at least the seminary that I experienced, which was very much allied with on the one hand, a very conservative approach to Catholicism. And yet, on the other hand, you get those same people behind closed doors, and there was a very sort of camp gay, I would say homosexual subculture going on. Now, I think that was partly because there is a certain amount of reaction formation, is that an awful lot of very conservative homosexual people are attracted to very authoritarian, conservative type of beliefs. A while back I was watching a YouTube video about a man who worked as a male prostitute, and I think it was in Florida somewhere, and he was saying that whenever the Republican conventions are in town, the male prostitutes are run off their feet, type of thing. And I think that it's because there are some people within the homosexual community who are very conservative in public, but in private are very not open about their sexuality, but are very open to practicing their homosexuality. And I think that is true within the conservative Catholic community. I think an awful lot of, when I see these young men going into seminaries and religious orders, and they love to dress up, they love all the high church ceremonial and wearing all the fancy vestments and the going around in their long robes and all that type of thing. It's sort of, I often think to myself, I wonder how many of those are really, get them behind the closed doors and you get a drink in them and they become screaming queens. Because I think that an awful lot of them, from my experience, are using religion as a beard. Do you know what I mean by that?
Mm-hmm. I do. Yep.
Yeah. In other words, that it's sort of, as long as they are maintaining the party line, and as long as they're pointing the finger at other people, nobody's actually questioning them. And so it's very easy to get into that way of behaving and thinking, and it can lead to a real subculture within the seminaries and religious orders. which is very dualistic. There's the private self and the public self.
Okay.
And it's very perhaps dissociative rather than dualistic. They separate part of themselves off to be the public religious figure, and then they have a private or private self, which comes out when they're with like-minded people.
So you mentioned, about this culture. So would you agree? So of the researchers that I've read and the information I've come across, it appears to me that because of the systematic way the church was set up, and this sort of purity culture and abstinence, that homosexuals, both men and women, sought out the church because it was an organization in which people with a non-heterosexual sexual orientation would not be expected to marry and have children. So the church was a safe place for them to go. And then you get behind these closed doors and you suddenly find, oh, hey, you're like me and you're like me and you're like me. And it sort of becomes like this boys and girls club where that's where all the gay men and women are going to get out of the public eye. Would you concur with that assessment?
In general, that is one stream of people. Certainly I can say for my own purposes and from my own experience that going into a monastery or into the priesthood was certainly a way of avoiding awkward questions about, funny he's never married, or why doesn't he have a girlfriend, or all that type of thing.
So even for you, that played a role in your decision?
I would say so, yes.
Okay.
Now, looking back on it, I mean, I don't think at the time. See, I think that sexuality is very complicated, and I think there is a tendency to one of the things I object to is that sort of somehow the idea that that if you go into an all-male environment, it will convert you to homosexuality. Now, that said, I think when you are in an all-male environment, even people who are normally and predominantly heterosexual, can and will act out homosexually. And as I say,
they call it.
Huh?
Prison gay, they call it.
Yeah, prison gay. If you're working in a submarine, if you're an all-boys school, all-male environments can bring out, because sexuality, as I say, is very complicated, and I don't think I think everybody is somewhere on the spectrum, and so I think that there's a certain amount of going into religious orders. Now, I don't think it's unique to Catholics. I think all religions, all of the major religions, tend to be rather negative about their view of homosexuality. So therefore, a lot of people are looking for a beard. And in many cases, if you're a Baptist, the beard is probably getting married to a woman. And you end up ruining not only your life, but often the lives of these women.
Your kids and your kids.
Kids. I see again on YouTube, there's a lot of these men who don't come out of the closet until they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s even, So people are still trying to figure out their sexuality, and they're trying, there's an awful lot again in the news about clergy of Protestant denominations who've been married for for many years, and have tried to suppress and repress their sexuality, and ended up in very unhappy marriages. And some of them never come out of the closet. Some of them just live their whole life trying to be heterosexual, or at least to live a heterosexual lifestyle. Now, I think that within the Catholic Church, an awful lot of people go into celibate religious orders, or the priesthood or seminaries, because, as I said, it gives them a cover. And nobody's going to ask questions. In fact, your status rises because people venerate you, because you're a holy man. And the same is true. I mean, again, I've seen an awful lot of news, even in Buddhist countries. I know that you live in Thailand, where they've had scandals in the monkhood there, of monks, using drugs and flying on aeroplanes and buying expensive alcohol, and even having sexual relationships. So I think it's not unique to the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church has its own stresses and strains in this area.
You said something interesting there a second ago, but now I'm trying to remember what it was. Let me just think for a second. Anyway, so let's go on. It'll come back to me. So if you have this situation, like you have this beard, is it a surprise to some of the people who come into seminary to go, oh, there's other like-minded people here like me that are looking for a beard, or they kind of know what they're getting into?
Well, that would vary very much from the individual.
Person to person.
I think some of them come in because they've had experience with clergy or seminarians, and they know that there is a gay subculture available to them when they come in. Others come in totally naive, and one of your interviewees talks about the junior seminaries. When people came in at the age of 13, they came into junior seminaries, and that is really very unusual nowadays.
Yeah, I would think so.
Very unusual nowadays. But many of the people, some of them come from Catholic schools run by religious orders, where, or even diocesan priests or nuns, or tend to be all male environments, and they're aware of, to some extent, a gay subculture. Others are more naive in their expectations, come in, and some, of course, come in very idealistically and fully determined to live celibate lives. But then when they get in, they discover that there are opportunities that they didn't know were available to them. And some people, of course, as in the people that get married, some people live a repressed homosexual life. And I think I made the distinction before with you, that I make a distinction between homosexual clergy and gay clergy.
Okay.
Homosexual describes your orientation. Gay implies a certain degree of acceptance, celebration, and positive views of your sexuality. An awful lot of people, I think, within the priesthood have a very negative view of their own sexuality, and so they repress it. And sometimes they act out and feel terribly guilty, and sometimes they just sometimes they develop what in more Protestant circles they call muscular Christianity. In other words, they live a life of repression and suppression, and see that as part of their sacrifice for God.
Right. That just trying to find it here. We talked offline. Oh, that's not the one I want. About Richard Sipe, who was in the movie, who was portrayed in the movie Spotlight. So for those of you who may have watched Spotlight recently, the reporters are on the phone with a researcher and who says, "Oh, we found like 30 priests. Is that sounds really high?" He says, "No, that sounds really low. That's Richard Sipe." Richard Sipe was a former Benedictine monk like John, and also a counselor like John, who specialized in sex and the clergy. And in his book, um, Sex, Priests, and Secret Codes, he cites, and I'm just pulling it up here, he cites a couple of 1970s psychological studies. There were two that had similar results, and it says 7% of priests are psychologically and emotionally developed. That leaves 93% who are not psychologically and emotionally developed. And of that 93%, or sorry, of the I think the whole, yeah, so 8% of priests, so 7% are emotionally developed, and a similar 8% are maldeveloped. So you as a psychological a psychotherapist yourself, I mean, obviously, when you've been out now for 30 years, but did you see evidence of that some of these, or the majority of the priests that you were, you know, not necessarily working with or studying with, but maybe just even casually, these people, that you saw some pretty serious psychosexual issues with these people?
So what I would say is, like I said, sexuality is very complicated, and when you're going to give out those type of statistics, you've got to compare it to the norm group.
Okay.
What is the norm group that you're comparing it to? I actually think that most human beings are not terribly psychosexually mature, and so I'm not quite sure that. I don't know how it compares to an average overall group of people. I think that it's not unusual that you have high percentage of people, especially if they've come in to the seminary or religious life, having had very little experience of romantic relationships. And of course, the younger you get them, the more likely they are to have less experience. But actually, we know that most males don't reach maturity till the age of about 25. And I'm not quite sure that everybody who reaches 25 reaches emotional maturity. And men tend to be behind women in that respect. Women tend to be emotionally more mature than men ahead of time. So I think that, as I say, when you're going to quote those type of statistics, you've got to compare it to the norm group.
I would think more than 7% of the average person, though, would be, or the average population would be psychosexually developed. More than 7%, I would hope.
Right. And again, that's probably true. Although, at what age are we talking about? And, increasingly we're seeing an awful lot of young men who are not very psychosexually developed. This whole incel movement, where which comes from the words involuntary celibates, who feel that they are misogynistic. They feel that women reject them. They can't get emotional attachments with women. There's an awful lot of work being with what's his name? I forgot. I'm blanking on the academic who's very popular at present, from New York, who's done a lot of research in these type of, and the dangers of these young men who are not very developed sexually, socially. So I don't. I'd like to see the statistics from other people, from the norm group, and other religious groups too. Is it unique to Catholicism, or is it also to be found in Baptists or Episcopalians, or so I'm always a bit suspicious of those type. Okay. And also to look at, well, what do they classify as psychosexually mature, at what age, and all those type of things that you've got to look at when you look at the, I think it was Oscar Wilde said, there's lies, there's damned lies, and there's statistics.
Yeah.
In other words, it depends on what you're quoting and what your evidence is, and certainly there are a lot of young men going into seminaries and religious orders. I think they're not very mature. I think they probably tend to take them very young. And the reason they tend to take them very young is because you want to get them before they get into romantic relationships.
What was that quote from the one of the founder? I can't remember if it was the Benedictines or the Francis. I think it was the Franciscans. Give me the boy, I'll give you the man.
I think it's the Jesuits.
Yeah, the Jesuits. Yeah.
Because when you get them young, then obviously they haven't had a chance to fall in love and experience their sexual desires, and of course the church has all the churches clamped down on the sexual desires. So masturbation is wrong, premarital sex is wrong, that whole purity culture within evangelical, the Mormons are really hot on all those type of things. So it's as I say, you've got to compare it to other groups.
Right.
I don't think it's unique to Catholicism.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah. So the one of the other questions I had for you was, so I presume then today, obviously in the past they were younger, but today most people coming into seminary, they're coming out of high school, they're like 18, 19 coming out of high school and into a seminary, or they maybe have gone to university and done an undergrad before they enter a seminary.
I would say most religious orders and even most diocesan seminaries would discourage people coming straight from high school. That's not totally true, but I think on the whole, they encourage people to go to university or get some life experience before they consider going into the priesthood. Or
that's not a bad idea.
No, I think on the whole that they realize that when you take somebody straight from high school, or you take somebody especially from a junior seminary where they've been since they were 13 or whatever, then their level of maturity is not going to be sufficient to get them through. But that's also one of the reasons why nobody's going into religious orders and seminaries nowadays, why the numbers have just dropped off the cliff.
That was the question I forgot earlier. Is the drop off in people going into the priesthood? I would assume it's probably a twofold factor. One, it's like people are dropping religion. A lot of people are turned off by the anti-women, the anti-gay agendas. But as well as society has shifted in the last, say, 20, 25 years, that homosexual culture has really come out of the closet, following Will and Grace and, mainstream acceptance in the US. You don't necessarily have to hide in the church anymore. So do you think it's maybe twofold? It's people are turned off by religion, but the people who were going into the church as the beard, they don't need to do that anymore. They can live their lives openly.
Absolutely.
So
I think
it's kind of like
again, it is multifaceted. I think it's certainly that the increasing number of nuns, not religious nuns, but the nuns who are non-religious, people is increasing within America, the US, and Western Europe. People are abandoning religion because they see it as constrictive and restrictive. That's part of it. It's interesting that vocations are flourishing in Africa and parts of poor parts, and in countries where the education level is much lower. But as people become more able to question religion and to question their belief in God, people are becoming more or less religious. So that's part of it. And secondly, as you say, there is a much more openness to sexuality and gender difference and sexuality difference, which is encouraging people to be more open in their own personal lives. Although there's still an awful lot of internalized homophobia, especially in cultures where that is deep-seated and deep-rooted.
Yeah, there's a good quote I'm reminded of from Max Planck about science and like accepting a new scientific theory. And he says scientific theories don't advance because the ideas are accepted. They come to be accepted because the old guard dies off and the new generation grows up with these new ideas. And we're sort of seeing that in the Catholic Church, that these old hyper conservative men are dying off, and you've got a much younger, more open-minded, dynamic priesthood coming up through the ranks. So I think it's going to be an interesting time. You mentioned like non-religious nuns. I've never heard that before. These are women who just want to live a cloistered life, but don't.
Nuns, as in None.
Oh, then sorry, those nuns. Okay.
The nuns.
Non-religious.
I meant like
non-religious. I meant a convent. Okay, I meant like a convent for the non-religious. Okay. The nuns. No. Okay, got it. Okay.
No.
All right.
And the point you were just making about a new generation, yes, there has been, certainly since the 1960s and the Second Vatican Council, an attempt to be more open to the world, less dogmatic, more open to diversity. And of course, Pope Francis has come out of that school. And people like the Jesuits were often at the forefront of that type of, and the introduction of liberation theology has, and the move away from clericalism, such as was exemplified by, say, Pope Pius XII. However, what we see now is a reaction against that, which came to prominence in the 60s and 70s and to some extent the 80s. And now we began to see a counter move. You saw the breakaway groups like the Archbishop Lefebvre and those, and now you see these groups that are affiliated with Lefebvre and his groups and other new religious orders, where the young men are going back to the old mass and dressing in the collars like this and living very outwardly austere religious lives, but
because they like that pageantry and the tradition.
They love
history.
They love to dress up, and they love to the incense and the high church music and ceremonial, and a lot of these young men are attracted, especially, and I think a lot of gay men or at least homosexual men are attracted by that. They like all that the
pageantry.
pageantry of religion, and because also within that they have there is a very high view of the priesthood. I remember years ago, I can't remember what it was, somebody I knew whose mother and father, once their son was ordained, they called him father. Right. No, so and that there was that culture of once you were ordained, you were put on the pedestal. And I think that an awful lot of people going into this type of conservative religion like that being adulated by the faithful, being that move away from the anti-clericalism of the 60s and 70s towards a more clerical view of, and I think probably the same is true like in the Buddhist culture in Thailand. The Buddhist monks are treated with tremendous respect by the faithful. And, that gets to your ego. When people come up and kiss your feet or, I've had, when I was a monk, people would come up and kiss my habit. Or kiss your hand. If you're Filipino, of course they do that with the older generations anyway. They would kiss your hand, or, when you're young, that goes to your head. That I can see why there's a certain amount of attraction to the old ways.
Right. I was reading on the section on the Fourth Lateran Council when the transubstantiation was declared, the literal transubstantiation, that it said it put new powers into the hands of the priests, and that you have these priests who some, I'm sure, some really believe they have the power, and others are like, yeah, hocus pocus, whatever. Like when you were a priest, like, did you believe you had these mystical powers, or you just kind of like winked and nodded and went along with it?
Well, yeah, that's a complicated question because obviously at some level you accept the hocus pocus. In fact, when you say that, I don't know how true it is, but I was told that do you know the dance Hokey Pokey, the Hokey Pokey?
No.
Oh, yeah. Well, maybe it's an English thing. You put your right hand in, your right hand out.
The Hokey Pokey. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I was told that was a takeoff of the Mass. That you put your right hand in, your right hand out, your right hand in, shake it all about. It's making the sign of the cross. You do the Hokey Pokey, and you turn around. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, Hocus Pocus is supposed to come from the Latin.
Yes, exactly. Hocus Pocus, same. So when I was ordained, I was certainly well along my road, not to atheism, but to a certain liberal Catholicism. And I certainly wasn't totally won over by all the philosophical underpinnings of that type of high theology of transubstantiation, because that relies upon a Thomistic and Aristotelian philosophy, which I didn't fully accept. But at the same time, within the Catholic Church, you were as when you were ordained, you were regarded in their theology as being ontologically different. You are no longer a layperson, you are a priest. And that required some sort of, and I don't know whether that when I was ordained, whether I understood that in Thomistic terms, but certainly in practical terms, like when you're ordained, you give your first blessings to people, and they come up and kiss your hands because your hands have now been anointed, and you are ontologically different from them. You are on a different spiritual plane.
Yeah.
So they venerate you because within Catholicism, the priesthood is the means by which sanctification takes place.
And that was one of the reasons, like when you watch Spotlight, one of the reasons why these priests were able to get away with the abuse for so long, because they were on such a pedestal.
Yes.
They were seen to be untouchable,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, I totally understand, though I don't agree with how the church handled that, because especially in as I say, in the 60s and 70s, the numbers of priests and religious were dropping. Even those people who'd been there for some years were leaving because of a crisis of faith, if you like. The numbers were dropping, and the church, who had years in the formation of these clergy. You go to seminary and you're studying for 7 or 8 years before you get ordained. So it's a tremendous investment of the church to get somebody to ordination. And many people drop out before they reach ordination. So the ones that get through, you want to keep them at all costs. Because there's not an awful lot of people behind them. So the tendency in the church is to cover up.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure.
And that's has proven to be a very bad policy.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely backfired on them. So
yeah,
it's definitely exactly. Bankrupted more than a few dioceses.
Right. But again, the other thing I also want to say, this is not unique to Catholicism. I think this, you're seeing it happened in the Jehovah's Witnesses, in the Mormon Church, the Evangelical Church, the evangelical churches. There was that big Haggard, the guy who had this big evangelical church in Colorado, and he was found that he was
John Hagee.
Well, no, not Hagee. Haggard. What was his name?
Oh, but yeah, Haggard.
Haggard.
Yeah, Haggard. Ted Haggard. Yeah.
Ted Haggard. Yeah. He was big, and he was one of the most influential people. And then they found he was, buying drugs,
picking up rent boys,
and picking up rent boys. And of course, he repressed it and went back in, and tried to found another church, but nobody wanted him after. So you see that in other churches as well, where there is a very negative view of homosexuality.
It manifests itself. It's got sexuality is, like you said, it's tricky, but it's natural, and it's so powerful that when you repress it, it's gonna pop up somewhere,
right?
In some form or another.
And of course, for most human beings, it takes time to work out one's sexuality and who you are, and what you're looking for in relationships, and so I think there's again, I don't want to quote statistics because I don't know. I'm not an academic. I don't study these statistics, but I'm always a bit dubious. It's a bit like political polls,
and you can make them say whatever you want.
And there's this huge margin of error. There's a huge, and as I say, I'm not quite sure how many people are sexual. How do you determine what constitutes sexual maturity? I think an awful lot of people are actually, Freud talks about stages of psychosexual development, And although an awful lot of Freudian theory has been rejected, I think there's an awful lot to the psychosexual development. And actually, an awful lot of people are fixated at certain stages. But I think what we should do is be trying to develop a situation where people can explore their sexuality and their relationships in a safe and a safe environment. And I'm not quite sure Catholicism is very good at that, but I'm not quite sure that that's unique to Catholicism.
Well, when I was in high school, we always knew that, the biggest, if you want to get laid, you go find the Catholic girls, like
Right.
I don't know if it was a factor of the just wore the sexy kilts, but they certainly had the reputation of being the looser of the women. And I always joke that Catholic girls like to have sex because they just say, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," and they're absolved.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know about, again, I don't know about that statistically or
It's probably
studying
just an
that.
urban legend, there's
Yeah,
probably no real truth to it.
some of it, like you say, I think it's got to do with the fact that often schoolgirls were wearing uniforms, and I worked in a girls' high school as a priest for a year, and the other thing is the girls grow up much quicker than boys, and they mature more quickly, and but I think that actually the majority of girls, that I don't know whether they're sexually more available than other girls. I don't know. I don't think that
Yeah.
I know the answer to that one.
It's probably just a perception more than a fact. So, yeah. Okay. All right. So I just wanted to play a clip here from, it was a documentary, it came out about 10, 12 years ago. It was called Mia Maxima Culpa, Silence in the House of God. And it was one of the documentaries that came out within about a decade of the Boston Globe spotlight, about boys in a deaf home who were being abused by the priests. And so Richard Sipe has a quote here. So, and allow. Okay. The system of the Catholic clergy selects, cultivates, protects, defends, and produces sexual abusers. You can see that on my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Would you agree with that sentiment that with the seminary system is selecting and cultivating, as we were talking earlier? Or that's a bit, maybe in his generation, like 40, 50 years ago when you had younger seminarians. Now maybe not so much that, they've gone to university. It's probably not so much, but maybe in his day he was seeing that. Would you think that he's right?
I think that there is an element of truth in that. Again, if you take the system that was prominent maybe 50 or 60 years ago, when people went into junior seminaries, which was an all-male environment from the word go, and then often maybe within those junior seminaries there was, as there were in an awful lot of private non-Catholic schools, even some of the in England, some of the well-known Catholic or non-Catholic schools, the private schools, there was often a atmosphere of sexual activity, sometimes between the boys, sometimes between the younger boys and the older boys, sometimes with the teachers. So I don't think it's unique to, but when you take them and you're preparing them for the priesthood at a very young age, you are certainly not putting them in an environment which encourages psychosexual development.
Right. do they still have junior seminaries, or have they mostly been
Like I said earlier, I think saying it happens nowhere. There are probably, especially in very conservative religious groups, there are probably junior seminaries, but I would say most religious orders, especially the more healthy ones, would now encourage you to graduate high school, go to college, get a degree, or get some life experience before you enter religious life or into a seminary. But that doesn't mean to say that those things do not still exist somewhere.
But
so I won't say
very few now.
Right. So I'm not quite sure it's as true now as it was perhaps when he entered. But that doesn't mean to say it's not still got an element of truth about it. Because even some of these that do come straight from college often are very immature psychosexually and never really develop in that area.
Is that just maybe because they're shy and awkward around the opposite sex, you think?
Probably a mixture of all sorts of things. So I'm a believer in I believe that you know the work of Robert Sapolsky.
The name sounds familiar, but I can't remember.
He's an academic professor from Stanford, and he argues that actually there is no such thing as free will. And actually, I think that the truth is that sexuality is something that unfolds in our lives, and we don't have any control over it. We don't have control over how we feel. We may have some choice over how we act, but our actual sexuality as it unfolds, and so I think that we are a mixture, and I think I've said this to you before. We are a mixture of genetics, which is, our parents, our grandparents, our great grandparents, going back in, and our culture, where we've come from, the country we were born into, the culture we were born into, the languages we spoke, but we're also products of our personality. Each person comes into the world with their own personality structure to some extent. Some babies are very easy to calm, others are more colicky and more. Some babies are very ill-tempered, and some are very easygoing. So we all come into the world with our own unique personality, and our psyche is developed over the years. Plus social, in other words, the people that we interact with, the religions we belong to, the schools we went to. So we are a mixture of these biopsychosocial conglomerates. And so I think that there are situations in which you can either encourage development in a healthy way, or you can discourage healthy development. And I'm not sure that, I think less so now, but back in his day, maybe there was less healthy development in the seminaries and the religious communities than there is today. I'm not convinced that today it's totally healthy, but it's a lot better than it was.
Oh yeah, well, it's changing, right?
It's changing, right?
The gay culture is evolving. It's becoming more accepted. Was it this year? I think it was this year or maybe last year, Pope Francis allowed blessings of same-sex unions as long as it didn't involve the sacrament of marriage, that they could be blessed by a priest.
Well,
So even he's coming around.
technically speaking, he represents the horns of the dilemma. He actually did not condone blessing gay unions. He condoned blessing gay people who were in unions.
Right.
He made it very clear, and even that caused ructions, especially in Africa, with the hierarchy in Africa, who wholesalely rejected that. What he wanted to do was bring about a thing where we could say, well, we can bless these. If you've got two people who are in a gay union, we can bless them as individuals. We cannot bless their relationship because that's sinful. And this is where he represents the horns of the dilemma. He's wanting to move the church towards a more holistic approach towards gay people, but he has a heritage of horrible homophobia within church, both in its doctrines and in its practices. And so he's trying the best he can to bring those, keep both in place, and he can't do it.
Do you think the church might fracture with, along these liberal and conservative lines?
It's happened to the Methodists, it's happened to the Episcopalians, it's happened to the Presbyterians. All the other denominations are splitting over the gay issue.
Yeah, and we've already seen, you mentioned earlier, like Lefebvre and these other like ultra right-wing schismatics. So,
right.
Yeah.
And, just recently he excommunicated, or the church excommunicated an archbishop for speaking out against his his opinions. And so I think, on the other hand, he has packed the College of Cardinals with people who are more reforming, as opposed to the previous pope, who was the opposite. So it remains to be seen the way the Catholic Church will develop. I think he made some very fundamental mistakes. I think that he tried to take on the gay issue, whereas I think he should have gone for a more low-hanging fruit. In particular, he should have gone after celibacy. Celibacy is not doctrinal, it is canonical. It is about canon law. You do not need to be...
1139, I think?
Something like that.
Second letter of Council, 1139. So,
right, so in other words, I think that if we brought more married men into the... If they brought more married men into the priesthood, it would revolutionize the Catholic Church. I think that would have been, for me, the more low-hanging fruit. He would have had terrible fight on his hands. But rather than go the gay route and trying to welcome gay people into the church, he would have got more traction on his reforms had he developed that area. Of course, it goes without saying, for me anyway, if they opened up the priesthood to women, that would be just phenomenal.
Maybe the next pope will take that on.
I don't know. Well, celibacy is possible. Women is, as with gay men, is a harder fight.
I would think celibacy is probably going to go the way of the dodo within the next probably 50 years. They're not going to survive without married men.
Right. Unfortunately, the whole church is geared towards celibate priests in the Roman Rite. The Orthodox and the Eastern Rite Catholics have always had married priests. And of course now they're getting Anglican priests who are converting, who are married, and they're bringing their wives. They've brought in married deacons. But I think that marriage for the secular clergy will be a tremendous step in the right direction.
And there's precedent in the first half of the church's history. So
absolutely, yes, and there still is within the Eastern Orthodoxy, as they say.
Right,
yeah. So I think that's not doctrinal, and that although the conservatives would hate it, they couldn't oppose it on doctrinal grounds.
Right.
Whereas they hate the fact that he wants to bless gay people. And I think that all the churches are splitting over this issue. Because there's still an awful lot of cultural homophobia. I mean, in some parts of the world, you can be thrown off a big building for being gay.
Yeah.
In Islamic countries, there's a lot of Islamic countries where it's a death sentence. It can be a death sentence. So there's an awful lot of cultural rejection. And as I said, the African bishops, the Catholic bishops, are wholesale against his openness towards gay people.
That's probably more cultural, like, the cultures of Africa that have been against homosexuality.
Yes, absolutely. But in Western Europe and the United States, where the gay movement has become more acceptable, even there it has struggled. I mean, when you think about it, things are very different now from what they were 100 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago. So it's, because of the inheritance of the Enlightenment, we have learned to question. It goes back to what my original thing about the all your questions answered or all your answers questioned. We have learned to question dogma, and the Pope Francis is one of those people who sits on a knife edge between wanting to modernize, yet at the same time, given the constraints that Catholicism puts upon people, it's very difficult to modernize. In the same way that the Southern Baptists, these people reject women's ordination because St. Paul says, I permit no woman to speak or hold authority in the church. And, as Billy Graham once said, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. When you have an authoritarian approach to religion, if you believe that the Quran is the last word of God, if you believe that the Pope and the teachings of the Church are infallible, if you believe that the Scriptures are infallible, if you have the more dogmatic you are, the less open you can be to questioning.
Right.
And if you can't question, then you're stuck. And that's where Francis finds himself.
That's led the church into some dark corners too, because now the churches, they've backed themselves into a corner doctrinally, canonically, that they can't get out of.
That's right. Again, I remember using that illustration with you before of painting yourself into a corner. Their own history is their own downfall.
Yeah.
And a study of the famous historian Lord Acton said, if we don't learn the lessons of history, we're doomed to repeat them. And unfortunately, the Catholic Church has a blind spot when it comes to its own history. It sets itself up as the great moral arbiter. How can a church that conducted the Spanish Inquisition consider itself a moral organization? How can the church
rapes children and covers it up?
Exactly. So the church has a way of saying, we're infallible, but we're fallible.
Yep.
And so it becomes very difficult for Francis and the modernizers who want to keep within the tradition of the church, yet at the same time want to open it up. So you get this what I call tokenism of Pope Francis. He may present as this sort of liberalizing pope, but it's really a facade. I think he's genuine, but it's a genuine facade because he really cannot question the basic dogmas. Yeah. His hands are tied, and he could not have got to that position had he not accepted that.
It's baby steps.
When a man is being considered for the episcopate, the Vatican sends round questionnaires to all the people who have worked with him or known him or interacted with him, and they ask questions like, does he uphold the teachings of the church? What's his views on abortion? What's his views on contraception? What's all those things? And you can't pass those tests if you are too liberal. So that's the way they weed out people, or people who have been too outspoken in those. So they weed out people who do not accept the party line. And Pope Francis could never have got to that position had he not been prepared to play the game.
Right.
So he plays the game. And now I have no reason. Yeah, and I have no reason to believe that he doesn't believe the game. Because he knows he can't change it, even if he wanted to. So he just knuckles down and does it.
Right.
And as I said, I think probably if you're going to stay in that, that was what for me was the problem. I could no longer do that. I could no longer, be seen as the representative of these dogmas and doctrines that I could no longer, in good conscience, uphold. And then I began to question the whole theism that underpins all that. Well, if these doctrines and dogmas are no longer relevant for me or upholdable, maybe the God who claims to be the source of them is also no longer acceptable to me. And when you start
have the intellectual honesty to admit that to yourself,
honesty or luck. Yes. I maybe my experiences. As I said, all those biopsychosocial. I was lucky. I had the right circumstances and the right. Now, looking back on it, I had no bitterness towards the Catholic Church. I'm critical, but for instance, when I look back at the monastery I was in, these were good men. These were good men. They weren't perfect by any means. They did a lot for me. I'm forever grateful for my experience there. Both in the monastery that I was with the Jesuits that I studied with, and the people that I met during my theology. I lived in a Franciscan community for 3 years when I was studying English literature. I have no nothing bad to say about the people individually. And generally speaking, I'm not anti-Catholics, but I am anti-Catholic. If you know what I mean. I mean, yeah. I'm not anti the people. There's an awful lot of great, good people within the Catholic Church who do tremendously good things. But I just think the institution that they belong to is wicked.
Yeah. Well, they have some reckonings to deal with. They've tried along the way, but they really haven't owned up to all of their mistakes.
No, because they can't. Mm-hmm. You can't stay in the church and question at the level that I questioned. And I think that there are people who, and that's why I joined the Clergy Project, although vast majority of them are former Protestant ministers, but I think there are an awful lot of clergy within the Catholic Church who tread a very fine line between maintaining, again, dissociative, like the dissociative self, the self that is the father with the collar and all that carry on, and what you truly believe. And I knew that when I recited the creed, I was not believing what the congregation were believing.
And that's when you knew it was time to go.
That's when I knew I had to go.
Yeah.
I could no longer say those words or sing those hymns, or and not believe it. Now I understand that there are some people who do it, like for instance, Jordan Peterson. I'm sure you've seen, Jordan Peterson. He comes out of a Jungian background where he does, and I think this is what an awful lot of people in the church do, is that they mythologize. So it's not a question of I believe in the resurrection, but I believe in the myth of the resurrection. It's not that I believe in a supernatural being called God, but I believe in the myth of God. And that's the way they stay in religion. They see it as mythological truth, not actual truth. But that's not what the vast majority of people in the pews believe. Right. And they would be quite shocked if you were to say that to them. Yeah. And so for me, in the end, I had to just say, no, I'm sorry, the price is too great.
Yeah, well, you got out, so.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, we've been talking now for about an hour and 15 minutes. Seems like a natural place to wrap this up. So, I mean, I know you've got to get started with your day. I have things I need to do. So yeah, thank you, John. I really appreciate the time you've given, both previously on our previous two chats and coming on today. So your insights are great. I love talking to you, and it's been a great conversation for me. So
good.
Thank you for.
Likewise, Jason. I appreciate it. Thank you for all your work. All right.
Thank you.
Take care now.
All right. See everybody. We'll see everybody on the next episode. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching. Please check out the other videos on my channel if history is your thing, and see you next time.